Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels, and I hope you all are having a good day. Now guys, guess what? The time you all have been waiting for has finally come. In today's video, we are finally going to be concluding the complete timeline story of the RMS Lusitania. When we last left the Lusitania, the ship had just sunk after being torpedoed by German U-boat U-20, and everybody who was on board the Lusitania who survived the sinking was now struggling for life in the cold Atlantic Ocean. Alright guys, well hey, with the intro out of the way, let's now conclude the story of the Lusitania. On Friday, May 7th, 1915, at precisely 2:28 p.m., 18 minutes after being torpedoed by German U-boat U-20, the RMS Lusitania sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. When this ship went down, she took 1,959 people that were on board the ship and threw them into the cold Atlantic Ocean. Now keep in mind that the ocean around the site that the Lusitania went down was nowhere near as cold as it was on the night that the Titanic sank, so it wouldn't kill right away. However, the water around the site that the Lusitania sank was cold enough that if rescue didn't arrive on site soon, then everybody who was on board the RMS Lusitania when she sank really did have the risk of freezing to death in the cold Atlantic Ocean. Now, just to give you all a little bit of context here, the water temperature around the site that the RMS Titanic went down at was roughly 28 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 2 degrees Celsius. Now, let's compare that water temperature to that of the water that was around the site that the Lusitania went down in. At the site that the Lusitania sank, the water temperature on that particular day was roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 12 degrees Celsius. So, as you can see, the water temperature was nowhere near as cold around the site that the Lusitania sank as it was around the Titanic. However, that is still very cold water. Now, in case you're wondering how long somebody can last in water of that temperature, let's turn to my favorite Titanic book, On a Sea of Glass, because it does have a chart in it that tells you how long people can survive in various water temperatures. So, according to this book, in water that is below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, so we're talking about the water temperature around the site that the Titanic sank, you would be expected to survive roughly 15 to 45 minutes. They think you would lose consciousness in around 15 minutes and that your heart would stop within 15 to 45 minutes. So, very low survival time in the water around the site that the Titanic sank. Now, let's compare that to the Lusitania. Around the site that the Lusitania sank, it would expect somebody to lose consciousness within 1 to 2 hours. That's when the effects of hypothermia would begin to kick in. And an expected survival time of 1 to 6 hours. So, as you can see, the people around the site that the Lusitania sank were definitely at risk of freezing to death if help did not reach them in time. However, help was on the way. Word of the disaster had already reached London, and they were working to try to get a rescue fleet out to the site that the Lusitania sank as soon as possible. The rescue mission was going to be launched from the town of Queenstown, which was roughly 20 miles or so from the site that the Lusitania sank. One of the first ships to begin leaving Queenstown was the HMS Juno, a military vessel that could reach the site that the Lusitania sank in less than an hour. However, right after the Juno left port, the Admiralty sent an urgent message to the Juno telling it to return to port and not to go to the site that the Lusitania went down. The reason the Admiralty did this was because they were afraid that the Juno would be torpedoed by German U-boat U-20 because they didn't know if it was still in the area or not. And where the Juno was a very valuable military vessel, they did not want to risk losing the ship. Instead, they decided to send a small fleet of smaller ships that would take a little bit more time to reach the site that the Lusitania sank. However, these ships were nowhere near as valuable to the Admiralty as the Juno was. So this was the plan that the Admiralty set in motion to rescue the Lusitania survivors. Now, it would take this fleet of smaller ships somewhere between 3 to 4 hours to reach the site that the Lusitania went down at. And where we discussed the water temperature earlier in this video, you all should know perfectly well that this was really pushing it in terms of survival time for all of those who were struggling in the water around the site that the Lusitania went down at. However, there may be a ship that would be able to reach the site that the Lusitania went down at much sooner. There was a British oil tanker close by, and this ship was known as the Narragansett, and I hope I said that name right. You see, this vessel picked up the Lusitania's distress call, and once it heard it, it changed course immediately and began to head for the site that the Lusitania went down at. However, due to this ship's position at the time that it changed course to head for the Lusitania site, well, it ended up sailing directly in front of German U-boat U-20, and of course, Captain Svigger spotted it immediately as it headed towards the Lusitania's sinking site. And what did Svigger do? Well, he immediately armed another torpedo on U-20 and prepared to torpedo the vessel. He got U-20 into position and fired one torpedo at it. Now, luckily, this torpedo missed the ship, so the vessel wasn't damaged at all in this attack. Now, after this failed torpedo attack, Captain Speaker only had one torpedo left, and he needed it for the return journey, so he simply had U-20 sail away from the area. However, when that tanker ship spotted that torpedo, it assumed that the distress call from the Lusitania was a fake distress call sent from U-20. So at this point, this tanker just simply changed course and headed back out to sea and didn't pay any more attention to the story of the Lusitania. Had that ship been able to respond to the Lusitania's distress call and had U-20 not tried to torpedo it, well, this vessel could have made it to the site that the Lusitania sank in probably roughly 30 minutes following the sinking. So this failed attack by U-20 definitely put all of those who were struggling in the waters around the site that the Lusitania sank in much more jeopardy. It took 4 hours for the rescue fleet to arrive at the site where the Lusitania went down, and once they got there, they began to pick up as many people as possible from the waters surrounding the wreck site. As the rescue operation was completed, they then took all of the survivors back to Queenstown. The survivors arrived in Queenstown at roughly 7 or 8 p.m. that evening, and all the survivors began walking ashore. Once the survivors went ashore, they discovered how truly terrible the situation really was. Of the 1,962 people that were on board the Lusitania, only 761 survived the sinking. And of that number, only 35 of 129 children that were on board the Lusitania survived the sinking. And only 4 out of 39 babies survived the sinking of the ship. However, it was quickly discovered that one person who no one expected to survive the sinking of the Lusitania, in fact, did survive. Captain Turner, who was on the bridge of the Lusitania until the very end, was washed out of the bridge on the Lusitania's port side, and then once he was adrift in the ocean, he was then knocked unconscious, but he was kept up and alive by his life jacket. He was found out cold in the water, and a rescue ship brought him aboard and took him to Queenstown, at which point Captain Turner did make a full recovery. Immediately following the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, there was a massive international outcry and condemnation against Germany. People simply could not believe that Germany would go out and attack and sink a passenger liner like the Lusitania. Now, in an attempt to calm the anger, Germany gave several reasons as to why they believed that they had every right to sink the Lusitania, and I'm going to tell you those reasons here in a second. Now, the first reason they said they had every right to sink the ship was due to the fact that they put a warning in the New York City newspaper leading up to the sailing of the Lusitania. They said because we put this warning in the paper, everybody who sailed on the ship knew what they were getting into, so Germany could not be held responsible for any of the innocent lives lost on this ship due to this warning. The second reason they claimed that they had every right to sink the ship was due to the fact that the Lusitania was classified as a military vessel. They also said that the ship was armed and that it was carrying munitions. Now, while it was technically true that the Lusitania was classified as a military vessel, officially the ship was known as an auxiliary cruiser, the claim that the ship was armed was simply not true. The Lusitania was not armed in any way, shape, or form on this voyage. I don't think she was ever armed throughout the entire war. Now, when Germany claimed that the RMS Lusitania was carrying munitions, this wasn't just a false claim that they made by just saying, oh yeah, we sunk the ship because we knew it was carrying munitions. They actually had a little bit of evidence to back up their claim that the ship was carrying munitions. Although, technically speaking, the munitions they were referring to wasn't classified as munitions at all. It was actually classified as small arms ammunition and stuff. You see, on the Lusitania's public manifesto, it stated that the Lusitania was carrying some small arms ammunition on board, so like rifle cartridges, unexplosive fuses, things of that nature. And when the German embassy over in the US saw this, this is what they used to try to back up their claim that, yeah, they had every right to sink the Lusitania. However, if you take a look at cruiser rules, the cruiser rules state that a ship like the Lusitania wasn't allowed to carry munitions. And when they say that the ship isn't allowed to carry munitions, they're referring to more high-grade military explosives and things of that nature. You know, things to be used in major weapons of war, not just rifle ammo and unexplosive fuses and stuff like that. So, technically speaking, if the Lusitania was only carrying this stuff, it wasn't violating cruiser rules. But here's where the first sign of controversy comes into play. You see, unofficially, the Lusitania was actually carrying some more high-grade military equipment on board that would be classified as illegal under cruiser rules. You see, Unofficially, the Lusitania was also carrying 46 tons of aluminum powder, which was used in the manufacturing of high-grade explosives. It was also carrying 50 cases of bronze powder, and it was also carrying a very large quantity of gun cotton. However, none of this stuff was classified on the ship's manifesto, or listed on the ship's manifesto. And if it had been public knowledge, well, it wouldn't have been good for the Lusitania. Now, the fact that the Lusitania was carrying the small arms ammunition was public knowledge that was available to anybody in the States. Anybody could look that up. However, this bit of information was kept secret over in the UK. However, no one knew that the ship was actually carrying this more high-grade military equipment on board.
However, despite these claims by Germany, it did nothing to calm the anger. In fact, you could even say that it made the anger towards Germany even worse. President Woodrow Wilson was furious at Germany for sinking the Lusitania, and he thought it would eventually bring the US into the war. However, as more time went by, photos and video showcasing how horrible the disaster truly was began to make their way around the Allied nations, and the anger towards Germany continued to grow.
Now, the British Admiralty noticed how much anger the public had towards Germany as a result of the sinking of the Lusitania. So what they decided to do was release a series of propaganda posters to try to entice more people to join the war effort against Germany. These posters would show the sinking of the ship. It would depict the victims of the sinking, and the posters would say things like, avenge your fellow Irishmen, join the war effort. So, as you can see, the British government really did try to capitalize the sinking to their advantage and use it to help win the war sooner.
1 month after the sinking of the Lusitania, an official inquiry was held in London where they were going to discuss the sinking of the ship. They called Captain Turner, several members of his crew, and several passengers who survived the sinking of the Lusitania into the inquiry to discuss everything that happened with the ship.
Another reason why they decided to hold this inquiry into the sinking of the Lusitania was because they wanted to find out who was truly at fault for the sinking of the ship. Now, while it was true that it was common knowledge that Germany was the one who ultimately sunk the Lusitania when they torpedoed it, they wanted to find out if there was any fault to be had on that of the British government, Captain Turner, his crew. They wanted to see if anything could have been done differently to help protect and safeguard the Lusitania. They also wanted to see if Captain Turner and his crew had made any mistakes that could have, if they hadn't have made these mistakes, maybe this horrible disaster would have never happened in the first place.
The head of the inquiry was going to be this man. His name was Lord Mersey. And, fun fact, this man was actually the head of the British inquiry into the Titanic disaster that occurred a few years earlier.
However, after the inquiry started, this was the time period that Lord Mersey noticed something odd. It seemed like that everything wasn't as it seemed with the inquiry into the sinking of the Lusitania. The first sign of trouble was when Lord Mersey noticed that there were only 46 witnesses called to testify about the sinking of the Lusitania. This was a surprise to him considering how many people actually survived the sinking of the ship, and their testimony could be very helpful in figuring out what really happened with the sinking of the ship. Now, Lord Mersey went to the British Admiralty and asked why only 46 witnesses were called to testify about this, and they completely blew him off. They did not answer any of Lord Mersey's questions. Now, most of the inquiry was held in public. People could watch it and, see what was going on. However, there were several sessions where everything was private and held behind closed doors. And during these private sessions, the British Admiralty did something odd. They completely went after Captain Turner. They completely tried to say that he was incompetent. He ignored their orders. They said, oh, we told you to do this, but you ignored it and did this instead. Even though Captain Turner had every reason to do what he did. And when he tried to say, this is why I did this, this is why I did this, this is why I did this, they completely ignored it. They would not hear what Captain Turner had to say. And then something else odd happened as well. You see, a lot of people were talking about how only one torpedo was responsible for sinking the Lusitania. However, all the people that were called to testify in the inquiry, well, they only selected people to come and talk if they said they thought 2 or maybe even 3 torpedoes sunk the ship. So it's like they were trying to hide the fact that only one torpedo was responsible for sinking the Lusitania. And at the time, Lord Mersey had no idea why. Now, as more time went by, Lord Mersey was beginning to suspect that something foul may be at play here. He was starting to suspect that maybe the British Admiralty was trying to cover something up with the way that they were going after Captain Turner. Now, eventually, the British Admiralty would realize that they weren't getting anywhere with Lord Mersey when they were trying to go after Captain Turner. And it got to the point where the British Admiralty actually came forward at the inquiry with so-called evidence that they were going to use to try to implement Captain Turner in the sinking of the Lusitania. This evidence that they presented was a series of documents that showed messages that they claimed that they sent to ships that warned them that U-boats were in an area that Lusitania was going to be sailing into. However, the thing is, these messages never existed in the first place. These warnings were never sent to any ships about these submarines. So, as it turns out, and Lord Mersey discovered this a little bit more investigating, these documents, well, the British Admiralty actually prepared two different sets of documents to be used in the case against Turner. But depending on if this inquiry session was held in private or public, that would depend on which documents were presented to evidence. So, as you can really see, the British Admiralty was really out for Captain Turner. And once Lord Mersey realized what the British Admiralty was doing, he was a lot more critical of them. But evidence was starting to pile up that maybe the British Admiralty was definitely trying to cover something up. And as it turns out, they were trying to cover up quite a few things. And I'll explain what they are in just a second. Now, the first thing that they were trying to cover up, which the British Admiralty has never admitted to, but we can figure this out by examining the available evidence, was the fact that the Lusitania was in fact carrying munitions on board. And they were trying to cover this up by only letting people testify who said that they thought 2 or 3 torpedoes struck the Lusitania and not one, like what really happened. Shoot, even Captain Turner said that he knew that only 1 torpedo struck the ship, but during the official inquiries, he said that 2 struck the ship. So it's like they were even talking to him about trying to cover up the fact that only 1 torpedo struck the Lusitania.
And the reason why they were trying to sell the story that 2 or 3 torpedoes struck the Lusitania and not 1, like what really happened, was because they may have been concerned that her illegal munitions cargo may have exploded when the single torpedo struck the Lusitania. So because they were trying to cover up this fact, they were selling the story of 2 or 3 torpedo strikes and not 1, like what really happened.
Now, the second thing that they were trying to cover up was something called Room 40. Now, Room 40 was top secret at the time of the First World War. And what it was it was a part of the British Admiralty where its primary objective was to pick up and decipher German wireless messages. You see, Germany was using the Marconi wireless system, just like all ships were during that time period, but they were encoding all of their messages with this code so that no one could read what these wireless messages said. However, Room 40 had deciphered the code, and they were reading every single message that these submarines were sending out during the First World War. But they didn't want the Germans to find out about it, so it's like they were trying to blame Turner for the sinking to pull attention away from that. Now, here's where the real big conspiracy kicks in with the Lusitania, because there's all kinds of controversy with it. It seems like, and again, this has never been admitted to, but it seems like the British Admiralty knew that U-20 was in the area that the Lusitania was about to steam into. Because what you guys may not know is Room 40 had been monitoring U-20 for about a month leading up to the sinking of the Lusitania. They picked up all of these wireless transmissions from the U-20 submarine. And the day before the Lusitania crossed paths with U-20, U-20 actually torpedoed several ships that were directly in front of the Lusitania's path. And the Admiralty and Room 40 knew all about this. However, no messages were sent to the Lusitania about these attacks. Captain Turner had no idea. Now, the head of the Cunard Line found out about it, and he went and pleaded with the Admiralty the day before the Lusitania went down to warn the Lusitania and have the ship be diverted away from where U-20 was. He even told the Admiralty to tell the Lusitania to take a northbound course above Ireland instead of going south. By doing this, it would safeguard Lusitania from U-20.
Now, because of the head of the Cunard Line's pleas, the British Admiralty did send a message to the Lusitania. However, this message wasn't what the head of the Cunard Line wanted the Admiralty to send to the ship. This message was that very cryptic, unhelpful message that we discussed in an earlier video. The message simply told the Lusitania that there are U-boats ahead of you and behind you. The message didn't tell the Lusitania about the attack where the U-20 U-boats sunk those ships directly ahead of the Lusitania's course, and the message definitely didn't tell the Lusitania to change course and take a northern route above Ireland instead of the southern route.
So the British Admiralty did not want this to become public knowledge. But because of all of this, it seems like that maybe, just maybe, the British Admiralty was hoping to put the Lusitania at risk. Now, in case you're wondering, why would the British Admiralty do this? Why on earth would they put the RMS Lusitania at risk? Well, if you take a look at all the evidence, it seems like they were attempting to use the sinking of the Lusitania as a way to pull the US into the war against Germany. Winston Churchill even said in a letter that we must continue to attract neutral shipping to the shores of Great Britain as a way to try to entice the US to enter the war with Germany. Now, it wasn't just this one claim and all the stuff that we've already talked about in the video that makes people think that something more shady was at play with the sinking of the Lusitania. There was actually other evidence as well. And the biggest one was, why did the British Admiralty fail to provide destroyer escort to the Lusitania? You see, that was something else that people talked about. The Lusitania was supposed to be protected by the Navy as the ship approached the UK coastline. And when the British Admiralty was asked if they were going to protect the Lusitania as it got closer, they shrugged it off and said that we can't protect every single ship that comes our way. We just don't have the resources for it. However, that wasn't true, because there were several military ships that were available to protect the Lusitania docked in Queenstown that were not doing anything. But the British Admiralty did not send them out to help the Lusitania. So when you factor in a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in this video, while we can't say for certain, it definitely does look like that something more shady was at play here.
Now, I do want to clarify one detail here. I want you all to know that I do not think that the British Admiralty intentionally sunk the Lusitania. And what I mean is, I don't believe that they were directly responsible for the sinking of the ship. I don't want you all to think that at all. However, what I do think may have happened was maybe a few of the highest ranking members of the British Admiralty at the time, well, maybe they decided to let the Lusitania sail towards the UK more exposed than she should have been. And maybe they were hoping because of this, the Lusitania would be attacked, and then they could use this as a means to pull the US into the war. Now, by default, I'm not a person who really puts a lot of faith in conspiracy theories. By default, I don't usually believe them at all. However, when you really study the sinking of the Lusitania, it's hard to look at this entire disaster and not think that there was some kind of conspiracy at play here, especially when you study all of the evidence. So now you all see firsthand why the sinking of the Lusitania is so controversial and why people still have a lot of questions about this sinking to this day.
Now, eventually, Lord Mersey would resign as head of the inquiry into the whole Lusitania affair. He basically just had enough with all the shady behavior that was going on. When he was later asked about it, he said that the whole Lusitania affair was a complete mess and he wanted nothing more to do with it. That should tell you how bad things were if the head of an inquiry was to resign. Good gosh. Anyway, eventually Captain Turner and the British Admiralty were cleared of all wrongdoing in the whole Lusitania affair. They said that blame for the Lusitania disaster rested completely on Germany because they torpedoed the ship. Now, it would take another 2 years before the US would enter the First World War. And while the Lusitania's sinking wasn't the primary reason as to why the US got involved in the war, it was a big factor. But yeah, guys, now you guys see why the sinking of the Lusitania was very controversial. There's still a lot of mysteries about the Lusitania that we do not have any information on to this day. If you go and look at the official inquiries into the disaster, you'll notice that documents from the inquiry are completely missing. There's still a lot of secret information about that. And in the 1930s, people said that they could see British ships bombing the wreck of the Lusitania. Now, they're like, why was this happening? You know, why were they bombing the wreck of the ship? It almost seemed like that there was something to hide there. However, if you want to know the official reason why they said that the ship was bombed, well, they claimed that they thought that they were U-boats from the Second World War. You know, because they said that the wreck of the Lusitania showed up on like their primitive sonar technology and it made it look like U-boats. So maybe that was why they attacked the ship. However, still kind of shady if you ask me. It's very But anyway, despite all of its controversy, the sinking of the Lusitania was a great tragedy, and so many innocent people lost their lives when this terrible disaster occurred. So I think we should, each and every single one of us, do our part to remember the disaster and remember all of those who lost their lives on that ship and pay respect to them, so their memory will never be forgotten. All right, everybody, well, hey, that concludes the complete Lusitania timeline series. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure you leave it a like, be sure to subscribe down below, and thank you all so much for tuning in. You all are awesome. All right, everybody, well, hey, I will see you all in the next one. Have a great day, everybody.
Special thanks to our captain level Patreon supporter, Dakota Charbonneau. Thank you so much for all the support, man.